National Socialist Germany has evolved in Western culture to represent something far beyond what it actually was historically. Now it's the Platonic form of evil. Hitler has taken the form of Satan in our culture as an evil which we are not allowed to humanize or understand. With the rise of the multicultural ideology, this is solidified and only become more intense as time goes on. Each side of the political spectrum will accuse the other of being Nazis in order to legitimize themselves. The left, of course, have taken this to the extreme. In their information bubble, at any time a black man who supports gun rights is a Nazi. Someone who reads an H.P. Lovecraft story and enjoys it, that's a Nazi. If a woman wants to be a stay-at-home mother, then she's a Nazi. Despite that the generation that actually lived through the war is largely gone, as time goes on, there is more and more media that is centered upon that war. People will reference this more than the events that occurred in their own lifetime, or even over the past year or so. It's the one and only historical event that people are truly interested. And even though 76 years have passed since the end of the war, it still occupies the minds of many people. As such, there is an intense amount of fiction that surrounds the Nazis and their regime. There were the Nazi exploitation films in the 1970s, where the dissident political deviance of Nazism and fascism was correlated with dissident sexuality. These films fit somewhere on the spectrum between torture horror films and softcore porn. And their focus is around the concentration camp and prisoner camps of, the National Socialist. So, some prominent examples I can think of off the top of my head. We got Sallow, 120 Days of Sodom, Ilsa, the She-Wolf of the SS, Salon Kitty, Night Porter, Holocaust 2, Beast and Heat, Gestapo's Last Orgy, I think Love Camp Number 9, and so on. Nazi porn novels, something that existed earlier, were actually really popular in Israel before the Adolf Eichmann trial in the 1960s. And then there's also a genre of exploitation films that don't just center on the Nazis. There's also, Japanese war crime exploitation films. Men Behind the Sun and Black Sun. And sometimes even Rape of Nanking porn, which gets sold in China. So it's interesting that the Nazis aren't just made into inhuman monsters you can't understand. They're also sexy. There are numerous first-person shooters that are centered upon the war, and, almost none of these focus on the Pacific War. They're almost always the European War, so you got Medal of Honor, Call of Duty, Battlefield, Red Orchestra, Day of Defeat, amongst, many, 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 right? There is, of course, a never-ending list of war films which depict frontline combat. But if you look at the films that depict the war, something you'll always notice is that the earlier that the films are made, the more human the Germans are, and the later the films are made, the more and more how they turn into cartoonish evildoers. Newer films don't humanize them. Kind of interesting. And, I think that one of the reasons, other than the left trying to make their enemies in the Nazis, is that earlier on, when these films were made to appeal to veterans who actually fought against the Nazis, they respected them. And, since there's no longer veterans who actually knew what they were like or interacted with them in any way, the Germans, they're no longer brave fighters. They're just, evil monsters, like slasher villains or something, right? And in general, you got to say that World War II is something that we're not allowed to switch from memory into history. It switches from memory into politics, right? So with World War I switched from memory into history. Now you can humanize the Central Powers and you can understand what they did, and you can even understand why their atrocities happened. many students in America, they're going to read multiple Holocaust books, fictional Holocaust books, sometimes factual memoirs of people that suffered through the Holocaust throughout, from elementary school. I remember, I think in 6th grade, they had us read them all the way till senior year in high school. Like every single year, the English teacher would have you read a book on the Holocaust. I mean, the staples, you have Anne Frank's diary and Eli Wiesel's. Is it Eli Wiesel or Eli Wiesel? Or Wiesel. Anyway, Night. It's really interesting, though, that, I remember very little talking about the Holocaust in history class. It was overwhelmingly focused on by English teachers. And you know what else English teachers focus on? They focus on the civil rights movement and the oppression of blacks under slavery. And since English teachers, I'm going to say, probably are more competent teachers, because in America, most history teachers are coaches first. And secondly, even if they're good history teachers, they're stuck with having to cover so wide a display of history with such a narrow level of content that my feeling is that the Holocaust and civil rights are really, if you went through from kindergarten to 12th grade, that's what's really going to get across to you. Maybe the American Revolution, and maybe the Civil War, but the Civil War will always be in the context of slavery. Nothing else will be learned, and then World War II will only be learned in the context of the Holocaust. And then the result of only these two things being your entire focus in American education as far as history goes is that people conflate them, and then they become akin in their mind. So, like, the Germans and the white Southerners are essentially the same thing, and then people are, like, thinking that the Nazis oppressed blacks or something, and then the Germans and the Southerners become all whites in the minds of a lot of minorities. It sucks. So anyway, reasons for this, you could say, are twofold. You have the conflating of the narrative and to the universal white oppression of all people of color kind of reinforces the ideology of progressivism. But the other is kind of more interesting, and it's more subtle. It's that most teachers are women, and most English teachers especially are going to be women. And military, economic, and political history doesn't appeal to women as strongly as social history is. So many women historians always focus upon cultural history or social history because they are more interested in the everyday lives of people than men are. So they really like the victimization and the struggle of a normal person being faced with the Holocaust. And they want to... This also goes into the maternal instinct, where they like to focus on the weak and try to mother them. As such, even without any kind of ideological agenda, they're always going to pick books about people, normal people, caught up and becoming victims, and fiction dealing with it. And so the Holocaust, over time, has grown and grown and grown into this industry of women being fascinated with it, and when they have no fascination with any other aspect of history. And it's kind of like another exploitation, if you will, of historical fiction which surrounds the Holocaust, and it appeals almost exclusively to women. And it gets really bad because there's been numerous hoaxes of children's books and memoirs of people that didn't even suffer in the Holocaust or completely made up their story of it. And so, because of all these hoaxes and because of this exploitation, this kind of emotional exploitation genre, it really also furthers preventing contextualizing World War II into a proper historical context beyond any ideological drive. But really, over the last decade or so, we've seen kind of this genre that started out in the novels become an exploitation genre of its own. And that's, Axis victory fiction, alternate history of Nazi German victory. And if you take the entire genre of alternative history, if you really think about it, Axis victory has to outnumber everything else, maybe even by double. Maybe 2/3 of all alternative history surrounds Axis fiction. That it's so pervasive, really, that it has its own tropes. And because World War II is not allowed to become historical, or at least the European part of it is not allowed to become historical for the West, that means that German victories are often bizarre in become this kind of world where evil is law. Some kind of crazy utopia where human life is seen as utterly invaluable. But I want to say I do value and enjoy many of these alternate histories. Especially the ones written before the Great Awakening. I think that this has really exploded after the Great Awakening because of the people trying to conflate their opposition into being Nazis, and that they live in echo chambers and that they don't understand their opposition, nor do they understand the Nazis. But, that new wave of science fiction, those ones, the original novel Man in the High Castle, that stuff's pretty good. As with everything else after the Great Awakening, though, they've simply become propagandistic hit pieces. So now we have the Amazon's adaptation of Man in the High Castle. Now you have the newer Wolfenstein games. And you have TNO, or the New Order mod for Hearts of Iron 4. And I want to outline how most of these tropes are completely unrealistic, given just a basic understanding of history and what came after World War II. The first trope I'm going to tackle here is there's always this idea that Japan was, if any of the Axis sides of the war was going to be lost, the European War or the Pacific War, well then obviously Japan was the most fucked, right? That Japan's going to lose either way. The reality is if either side was going to win for the Axis powers, it would be much easier for Japan to win. The reason is that Japan's efforts in World War II are seen now as more suicidal than the Germans, because of this disparity in industry between the United States and Japan, and how huge a comparative disadvantage that Japan was supposedly vis-a-vis German industry. So if you were to list out the major powers of World War II, and going back and trying to recreate a GDP is really, really shaky, but we know this at least, that on the verge of World War II, if you go through the 8 major powers, it would have went like this. The US had the most GDP, then Germany, then USSR, then the UK, then France, then Japan at number 6, then Italy, and then China. But even if this was the case, the reality is the economic weakness of Japan in the context of the Pacific War actually meant a lot less. That's because it had mainly to do with naval war. Naval warfare is something where quality matters much more than quantity, and it always has. Even in modern naval warfare, that's true, because naval battles are always going to be set-piece battles. When you look at modern warfare on land, as long as your officer corps isn't Arab and you have sufficiently modern weapons and you outnumber your opponent by a considerable margin, the odds are always going to be with you. So Germany was always going to be run down in some kind of land war. But for Japan, they could have won set-piece battle after set-piece battle. Individual power battles here would have way more importance in naval warfare. So even though America could outproduce the Japanese Navy, the skill or luck of the Japanese Navy ultimately mattered more to the outcome of the Pacific War than the skill or luck of the Germans in the land battles of the European War. And that's because in naval war, defeat in detail, in modern naval war that is still much easier to accomplish than it is with an industrial land war. A smaller superior force could be outnumbered and then defeat its enemy in detail in set-piece battle after set-piece battle because of better leadership, higher level of luck, and so on. A smaller land army has to be dispersed over a huge front, where the advantages that would have existed in the past with set-piece battles, say for Napoleon, or any other battles in history really prior to the Civil War, would have been set-piece battles. Now it's massive fronts where there is hundreds of thousands of soldiers dispersed against that front. There aren't set-piece battles where a smaller army that's better led or better equipped or has better level of soldiers could defeat larger armies through a set of battles and defeat them in detail. But this is still true, especially in World War II with land battles. So what really mattered at the beginning, at least, of World War II was how well the pre-war Navy would have done. Because ultimately, if the Japanese pre-war Navy were actually able to knock out all the American carriers, as well as their victories at Pearl Harbor, and the massive advances in the first 6 months of the war that the Japanese got, that would have pushed America's ability to retake the initiative years away than it would have actually had been. So let's say in an alternate history, Japan was more lucky in the Battle of the Coral Sea, instead of it being some kind of stalemate or draw. And then there's a Battle of Midway where Japan was already lucky in the Coral Sea, and then they get lucky again. Obviously, they were extremely unlucky, and the real history in America was very lucky. But if Japan had the extreme luck that America got, if it was just flipped, then that would have crippled America's offensive potential into 1943 or 1944, regardless of the huge industrial potential of America and disparity between Japan and America. And even despite the disparity in these forces, Japan could actually be lucky in set-piece battles again. Remember that Japan defeated both the Asian and European navies of Russia in set-piece battles in the Russo-Japanese War. And that's something that happens time and time again. A better prepared navy and a better led navy can defeat a much larger navy in set-piece battles. But keep in mind the Japanese were inclined historically to be a lot less lucky than the Allies, because I think by the time of Midway, the Japanese naval code had been cracked. But let's say the Japanese naval code isn't cracked and they get lucky. That's a much easier thing to allow for the Japanese victory in the Pacific War. Now, going on, something you got to keep in mind with the Pacific War is that it's contesting ground which for the Allies is of far less importance than Europe was. And the reason for Europe first was that Germany threatened the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union with total defeat. Japan would be never able to directly threaten the homeland of any of the major powers. The vast tracts of the Pacific waterways, the European colonies in Asia, and the Chinese mainland doesn't directly affect the lives of the British, American, French, or Soviet civilians. So negotiation with the Japanese would be much more palatable to them than any negotiation with the Germans. The Japanese simply just aren't the same existential threat that the Germans would have been. Since the rest of the industrial world was so far removed from the Japanese heartland, that meant that the Japanese had a greater advantage in defense or attritional warfare than compared to the Germans. Indeed, had the Japanese not surrendered in 1945 after an apparent defeat and fought on to the better end, had the Germans had, then the war could have extended into 1946 definitely, or even into 1947. Had the Japanese got lucky at Coral Sea and then Midway, then it would have extended deep into the 1940s, dare I even say the 1950s. Would the Allies be willing to fight over land and sea lanes which aren't of vital national interest for them for a decade? Considering all these things, a negotiated peace would be much more likely to end the Pacific War, and thus a Japanese victory would be much more plausible and probable than a German victory, especially if the Japanese were able to threaten the Panama Canal, because if the Panama Canal was knocked out, the Americans simply could not continue the war. The second contention I want to address is the Cold War between Germany and Japan, or a Cold War between the United States, which is not victorious over Germany, but is victorious over Japan. That Cold War is fucking stupid. And it has to be supported by some German ideological need or some American ideological need. I'm going to address why the Germans would actually not have such an intense ideological need. And, and they would probably moderate after a war later on in this video. A lot of people think that the contention between the strongest powers in the world is inevitable. So, a Cold War is going to happen, or some kind of rivalry is going to happen, as long as there are two or more major powers that are very strong. The reality is that if states don't have a direct conflict over a certain region which they both share interest in, then that conflict is going to be a lot less likely. So Germany and Japan have no ideological reason to go to war with each other, first off. And in fact, that the only state that would have any ideological reason to go to war would really be America, kind of to spread democracy. But that's something that happens all the way until the 2000s. And if they were to lose the war, right, don't you think they would just become isolationist again? In the Cold War, beyond if we simply ignore the clear ideological conflict, there are some pretty clear regions which are in contention between the United States and the Soviet Union. You got the city of Berlin being split into two, with West Berlin being left within the communist East Germany, and then Germany itself is split into two. Then you have Korea divided into two. And this is both by the Soviet Union and the United States directly. Furthermore, China and Vietnam are going to be split into two with ideological communist and non-communist powers, right? If Germany won, there's going to be no country that's going to be divided between two spheres of interest. So Japan is all the way in Asia and all the way in the Pacific. They're not dividing anything with Germany. The United States is going to be in the Americas. They're not dividing anything with Germany. The most likely contention between spheres of influence is actually Italy and Germany, not Germany and Japan, or Germany and the United States, or the three of them together. Another thing which is so utterly mind-boggling and so stupid is this idea of some kind of civil war in Germany. And, I think that a lot of the reason this is done, especially in something like TNO, is because they want to show that extreme ideologies are always going to purity spiral. And this is going to result in a civil war because of this purity spiral. The problem with a civil war in a single-party state like Nazi Germany is that first of all, there's not going to be a clear reason to happen. But if there's going to be a civil war, there's no regional power which can resent central authority. And actually, coups are really uncommon in single-party regimes. Much more uncommon than they are in democratic regimes. And the reason is that rather than being supposedly apolitical, or meant to be apolitical, as in democratic regimes, and therefore, if you have a left-wing government or a right-wing government, right, they're going to be in contention because the military is going to have different objectives than the civilian government, and the two are going to be in contention. In a single-party state, they're not apolitical. The militaries are highly politicized by the single-party state, and they're going to be subservient to the civilian leadership than in any other type of government. And once this goes on for decades, all the junior officers are going to start by being politicized members of the party, and the entire establishment of the military, as you would see in the Soviet Union or modern China, is going to be ideologically loyal to the state. So Hitler was running Germany under the emergency powers of the Enabling Act. And, the Weimar Republic's constitution is actually still in force under the Enabling Act, if you can believe it. The office of Führer was something that was never really formalized by a new constitution. Rather, the Nationalist Socialists would never create this new constitution. They simply combine the powers of the Chancellor and the presidency together after Hindenburg died. So in many alternative histories, this is where there's, in the more political ones that have come out after TNO, you have TNO and the Thousand Day Reich, right? or Thousand Week Reich, I should say, where you have a civil war. But in the earlier ones, like Man in the High Castle or The Ultimate Solution, there's this contention between the powers, and it's not quite a civil war, but it's this violent contention between the different powers in Germany because the Führer was never legally set up. I really, really doubt that the Germans would have allowed this to happen if they were victorious, because Nazi Germany was really, really focused on ensuring that all their actions had some sort of legal legitimacy. So if they won the war, obviously the first state of business would have been to create a constitution and outlaw what the Führer really is, that office, or simply to split it into its constituent parts of president and chancellor back. But in real life, that's what Hitler did. When he died, he simply split the constituent parts of the president and chancellor. So Goebbels becomes the chancellor and Dönitz becomes president. That's how it really went. There was no power struggle, right? Dönitz and Goebbels were simply took the powers that they would have had under the actual Weimar Constitution. And keep in mind that Hermann Göring was trying to assume that Hitler was already dead, and that he was trying to say either already dead or would be cut off from being able to lead the troops. He was asking of Hitler to be directly given Hitler's powers once he died. So Hitler actually stripped Göring of these powers at the, this is in the end of April during the Battle of Berlin, I believe April 23rd. So this is pretty far ahead. But Göring was originally set to have been the Führer or the president of Germany. It's also important to note that most of these victory scenarios occur after the invasion of the Soviet Union. So Rudolf Hess's flight to the United Kingdom would have happened, and he would have been in prison and so on. So that means that Martin Bormann would have become, the head of the chancellery. And Martin Bormann was an extremely competent individual, highly, highly intelligent. Rudolf Hess was this yes man for being Hitler's vice Führer. Martin Bormann, he took control of the entire German domestic sphere for Hitler. Because Hitler was so obsessed with the war, he let Bormann control all the domestic spheres as essentially his second in command through salutary neglect. So in this sense, Bormann had the same power which Marxist-Leninist regimes had, because he was the leader of the Nazi Party. So if you go through all Marxist-Leninist regimes, starting with Stalin when he took power, the person who's in charge of the Communist Party is the person who runs the country, right? The head of the Communist Party. Not the person who's legally president or premier. Actually, the head of the Communist Party is who's in charge. So if Germany went towards that direction, that's what it would have seemed it was going at the end of the war, then that would have meant that Bormann would have been the clear successor, and he would have followed kind of Stalin's footsteps. And Bormann definitely was a much harder worker than Göring. So if Hitler died, you'd have something like a triumvirate, either split between Göring and Göring, or Göring would get the presidency, someone else would get the chancellor. Let's say we got it historically, Goebbels and Bormann. And Bormann probably would have been able to outmaneuver them through just how much more competent and just a hard worker he was than everybody else. But regardless of all this, power struggles within single-party states are done through purges. It's very, very hard for them to have coups or civil wars. So you would expect something like a triumvirate where Göring or Goebbels would go into exile, and then Bormann would probably take power. And really, the reason that coups and civil wars don't happen, as I said before, is that the military has been highly politicized and local power structures have been centralized. So there's no independent regional power bases that people can, use to fight back against the center. Now it's time to talk about the elephant in the room, the big deal, what's very, very important and probably is controversial to a lot of people that aren't well read or simply are completely incapable of understanding Germany within its historical context. And that's that Germany would have been much more moderate than had they won the war. They would have become more moderate. They would have become much more moderate than they're depicted in alternative history, and much more moderate than they would have actually been in real life during the later portion of the war. And I'm not being a Holocaust revisionist here. I'm not being pro-German here. Everything I'm going to say here is mainstream history. In mainstream German and Holocaust history, there are two camps: functionalists and intentionalists. Functionalists believe that the National Socialists were pragmatic in their policies and goals, and these policies and goals were in flux throughout the war and prior to the war as the diplomatic situation changed. Intentionalists believe that the total annihilation of the Jews and to a certain extent the Slavs had been planned before the Nazis ever took power. I am a functionalist, to be very blunt. And I would say the strength and support for the intentionalist side in World War II is mainly political. I would say all the strength for the functionalist side comes from actually understanding the real history and reading the documents and learning about Germany. The Germans were always pragmatists, especially before the war and during the war. In the war itself, the Germans finally, at the very end, they abandoned the final solution. They definitely abandoned General Plan Ost. And after the destruction of the Hungarian Jews, so let's go to the final solution first, the remaining Jews would have been used for labor in the final months of the war. Most of the Jews of Western Europe died as a result of famine and forced marches. And the Jews that were left, they died of famine and forced marches. And after the Germans were reversed on the Eastern Front, talking about General Plan Ost, the planned genocide of the Slavs, the Eastern Slavs, after the Germans were reversed on the Eastern Front in 1943, the Germans straight up just abandoned General Plan Ost and any kind of genocide of the Slavs, and they actually allied with them. So they didn't just form armies. They allowed Eastern Slavs, Russians, Ukrainians, to join the SS. Ultimately, they would allow the Czechs to join the SS at the end. I should note they never allowed the Poles to join it. Let's go back to the Holocaust here. The only reason that the Italians, Bulgarian, Romanian, or Hungarian Jews were ever subjected to the Holocaust is because though each of those countries, when the Allies approached on them, they attempted to surrender, and then the Germans invaded them and took control of them and then deported their Jews, right? None of the German allies were like, the Holocaust is something we want to do. They did not want their citizens to be subjected to that. They definitely didn't want they viewed their Jewish citizens as their citizens. Maybe, in Hungary, the Jews didn't have equal rights, but they were definitely their citizens, and they weren't just going to be like, here, Hitler, kill our own citizens, right? In fact, even deep in the 1944, and the reason the Hungarian Holocaust was so brutal is because many Jews that were in German-occupied areas fled to Hungary. And this continued right until 1944, until they attempted to surrender, and then the Germans took control of the country, then deported those Jews during the last year or so of the war. But ultimately, they're going to, see that the genocide, in this point, the Reinhardt camps would have been abandoned. That the genocide using Auschwitz, that they're going to abandon that, and they're going to use them mostly for forced labor. Now, going back to the final solution as a whole, it happened due to war conditions. And this is well known because war makes regimes and populations way more extreme than they would have been otherwise. And this process, as a name, is called cumulative radicalization. Nearly all genocides in history are a result of cumulative radicalization. And the reason this happens is that the intense strain of wartime conditions radicalize the people to a point where they can commit them. Had this strain of war not been as intense as it really as it ultimately became, then the Germans would have likely stuck to their original plans of expulsion. As before the war, they expelled them into other European countries, sometimes by force, but mostly just trying to, take all the rights away from the German Jews, that they would just leave the country themselves. If the Germans had won, they probably would have tried to do the Madagascar plan and try to expel the Jews into the occupied territories of the French. Something that a lot of people forget is that German atrocities were conducted with utmost secrecy, though. So, with this politicalization of Germany, there's this popular conception that the German population was completely aware of the final solution and actively supported it. Well, the exact opposite was true. German atrocities were never relayed to the public. The final solution was an extreme secret with no paper trail. According to mainstream history, the Germans meticulously hid all physical evidence of it, both from their own public if they had won, and from the Allies as they advanced upon the German-occupied territories. The Operation Reinhard camps in Kelmo, where the bulk of the Holocaust took place, were in remote locations. And the majority of the Jews that died in Auschwitz too were Hungarians who were killed after the Operation Reinhard camps were destroyed to hide the evidence. The entire Holocaust revisionist movement is predicated upon the lack of physical evidence for the death camps and an extreme dearth in documentary evidence. It's interesting if you look at the Book of Fatherland, which is one of the better Axis victory stories. The entire book is predicated on examining the consequences of the Holocaust being a state secret. And it's a mystery novel where a German, I believe, police officer or detective discovers that the Holocaust happened. And the Germans are terrified that their own populace will learn of the Holocaust, as it would undermine the legitimacy of the state. And in the story, once it's spread outward by a German detective himself, it undermines the legitimacy of the state. With Operation Ost, the planned removal or genocide of Eastern Slavs, I already addressed the fact that this was abandoned in real life in 1943, and the Eastern Slavs became important allies to the Germans. So, the plan to genocide them or force them east was the Hunger Plan, which is the forced starvation of the Slavs in a post-war, and that was planned by Germany. Alone, right? But America had its own plan that's very, very similar. It's called the Morgenthau Plan, and that was the forced starvation of the Germans. But that one was never carried out, and that's because the Slavs and the West Germans, it's better to keep people alive. People are much more useful alive than they are dead. And if the Germans had been so secretive of their genocide of the Jews during wartime, after the war, during peacetime, how could they have conducted a genocide of an order of magnitude greater? After the war, during peacetime, it's just insane, retarded, stupid. And the Americans they had a plan to genocide the Germans using a forced starvation. They didn't follow through with it. I don't think that the Germans would have followed through on it either. In fact, it's obvious that they wouldn't have. I already talked about how Japanese victory in the Pacific would have looked like and why it would have been more likely. That's where you have a stalemate where the Americans, rather than trying to take years and years to take back land and set peace battles, and instead just seek peace. But if we look at Japan again, in China, the Japanese invaded and had no exit strategy. They just occupied most of China. And then the Chinese, the Nationalist Army and the Communist as well, they fled into highly mountainous regions, even though they were in a purely defensive role now, and that they couldn't conduct offensive warfare because of their depletion of resources and factories to build advanced weapons. they weren't defeated, and the Japanese had no clear exit strategy. So the Japanese would have to negotiate with the Chinese instead of trying to force some kind of unconditional surrender. So going back to Germany, they would have been caught in the same sort of thing. Let's say they win the Battle of Stalingrad or some kind of comparable battle at the Caucasus. Then they have to fight some kind of war, some kind of battle in the very north of the Soviet Union. Now, let's say they win the Battle of Stalingrad by, say, the historical point it ended, February 1943. Then they have to fight some kind of battle in the north of the Soviet Union to seal the ports of Murmansk and Archangel in order to finally push the Soviets into a similar permanently defensive position where they can no longer conduct offensive operations like the Japanese pushed the Chinese to. Well, the Germans still don't have an exit strategy, and the Soviets, they have most of the industry behind the Ural Mountains, and they have this huge, great defensive barrier of the Ural Mountains, which the Germans would take extremely heavy casualties trying to take. So that would have meant that had the Germans even won the war, you had to have some kind of negotiation between the Soviets and the Germans to end this stalemate. Because the Soviets are going to be behind this natural defense. And because of this negotiated peace, it's really hard to imagine that the Germans negotiate peace and then they're going to genocide, whatever they get left from the Soviet Union. Like, after the Soviet Union still exists and to a certain extent is going to have the ability to continue the war against the Germans. It's really hard to see them in peacetime genociding what little part they have left. They're not going to get all of Russia. They're probably going to get Belarus and Ukraine, maybe the Northern Caucasus. It's really hard to see them genociding the Eastern Slavs there. Now let's finally talk about life within peacetime Germany itself. Fascist and right-wing third positionist regimes are authoritarian. That's true, but they're not totalitarian. And the reason for this is simple. There are institutions which continue to be independent within these states. But when we look at the Marxist-Leninist regimes, the reason they're totalitarian is because there are no independent institutions within them. Because there is no businesses, there's no corporations, and there's no churches. In Germany, you have private businesses and you have churches as independent bodies after the war. Sure, the Protestant churches would have been made into a state church, but the Catholic Church would actually have to be annexed or defeated through some kind of German invasion of Italy or something again. Which is funny because I talked about how Italy is really the country that would be at odds with Germany rather than America or Japan. But even there, it's kind of hard to see the Germans oppose the Catholics whole stop when they're a third of their country, and that their ideology is going to be supporting Christianity, at least to a certain extent. Remember, the whole occult thing is really exaggerated, right? It's some sensationalist thing, and Hitler did not support Nazi occultism. This is just this weird thing that existed in the Thule Society, and this is something that Himmler personally believed in. This isn't something that the Nationalist Socialist Party, even by a long run, supports. It's really just something that Rosenberg and Himmler supported, this rebirth of occultism or this rebirth in paganism. Hitler hated that. And Bormann may have been anti-Christian, but he wasn't going to try and recreate paganism. So, as you want to say, the super no-noism of TNO, the idea of trying to create some kind of state paganism or state pagan church, it's just a huge long shot. I'm not saying it's completely impossible, but you have almost the entirety of the Nazi party that would be opposed to it. And if you understand how single-party states really work, the party as a whole ultimately has more power than any single leader. Just look at what's happening in China right now, or how the Soviet Union went. Keep in mind, these independent parties, they would have known what was going on. And, they probably aren't going to support any genocide of the Slavs or even a genocide of the Jews. Going further afield, the Germans would have not had the economic ability and resources to garrison all the territories that they had conquered and to have them as colonies, especially industrial European states. So they would have had to leave these territories and either install puppet or allied regimes, right, as they did in Slovakia and Croatia and in France. They would have to hand the northern part of France back to Petain. And such an armistice with the Soviet Union would have provided a reason for them to create independent states in the Baltic, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, and as well as a Belarus, Ukraine, and maybe even an independent state in the Northern Caucasus. So rather than like Germany annexing Belgium and then annexing the Dutch and then annexing Denmark and then annexing Belarus and so on and so on and so on, the Warsaw Pact model that the Soviets did, that would make a lot more sense economically, and because the Germans would not have been as extreme as they would have been forced to under the natural strain which wartime forces people into, and that their populace, which would not be under the extreme strain of within fascism, which they would be under, Marxist-Leninist regimes where there is no independent bodies at all, wouldn't have supported this brutality either. They would have wanted the country to have a post-war boom instead of occupying this territory and then, something crazy like killing all the Slavs, killing all the Frenchmen in northern France, and then having like breeders or something having like breeder women that are sex slaves for Germany. They're going to have 20 kids so that they can colonize European Russia. Like, that's not going to happen. That is just as realistic as Ilsa She-Wolf of the SS, okay? TNO is less realistic than fucking Nazi porn with dominatrixes, okay? With all this being said, I want to get back to this and say I do find a great deal of value, and there's a lot of fun to be had with a lot of these Axis victory scenarios, even when they're LARPy, at least prior to the Great Awakening. And something like the Ultimate Solution or the Man in the High Castle, they aren't really meant to be realistic. Rather than they're meant to be fun. They're meant to be fun novels, and that's the whole point of them. To make alternative history not just speculation, but into something for which a narrative exists. And that narrative requires some kind of hook or sensational aspect for it to be appealing. It's a lot less appealing if Germany just wins the war and then creates puppet states, in Poland and France and in Belarus and Ukraine, and there isn't major war, and then maybe Germany slowly moderates, and these countries get back their power. Germany forgives the Eastern Slavs, and then there's a new generation of Nazis, right? That's a lot less entertaining than like, there's no Jews left on Earth, and the Germans are going to colonize Mars, and Japan and Germany are ready to nuke each other at any moment, and Italy is drain the Mediterranean, right? That's really interesting and fun. Not like, well, there's no more major wars in Europe, and the German Empire slowly diminishes because of salutary neglect, and then, as generation after generation goes by, Nazism just becomes like, an entrenched bureaucracy of a single-party state. And the reason for this, and the reason for this to be so popular, is people find the Nazis, people find National Socialism really, really fascinating because it's so far removed from what A, they're supposed to believe, and B, how history's supposed to go. People in America are taught that we're on this unlimited march towards social equality. Well, they're this dissident, movement, and most white Americans are German, and it's in Germany, and it was 60 years ago, and it's highly politicized, so we can't understand it within a historical context. So it's really become this avenue for all this weird what the fuck stuff, rather than like, oh, it just kind of, it's more realistic, right? Regardless, if any of you guys find a copy of The Ultimate Solution in a used bookstore, which would probably be like $500 online on eBay or something, just sneak it to me. Just sneak it to me, please, please. I would really appreciate it.